The first frost, you know that feeling when the seasons shift, when summer fades, autumn rolls in, and the air gets that little bite of cold. Today, most of us pull out a hoodie, maybe order a pumpkin spice latte, and call it good. But in medieval times, that first crisp breath of cold air wasn't something to enjoy. It was a warning, a whisper from nature saying, good luck surviving the next 6 months. For people back then, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test that you had to pass every single year, whether you liked it or not. And the first frost was the opening bell. Dread in the air as soon as mornings turned frosty. Peasants knew life was about to get harder. Days were shorter, nights were darker, and every chore doubled in difficulty. The first frost meant it was time to hurry and finish preparing. If you hadn't already stocked up on food, patched your roof, or gathered enough firewood, you were in trouble. Winter wasn't polite. It didn't care if you were ready. It simply arrived, slowly but surely, and then locked the countryside in ice and mud. Imagine looking at your field after the frost. No more green, just hard ground. Whatever crops you had managed to grow that year were all you were going to get. If the harvest was bad, the months ahead promised hunger. No grocery stores, no drive-through soup, just the slim hope that your cellar had enough cabbages, grains, or salted fish to carry your family through. Preparing the homes weren't built for comfort, at least, not the way we think of comfort today. A peasant's house was usually one big room, maybe two if they were lucky. Walls were made of wood, mud, or wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and plastered with clay and straw. Cozy, right. When the frost came, families stuffed straw into cracks in the walls, hung old cloth over gaps, and hoped the wind wouldn't whistle through too much. Roofs leaked, doors warped, and windows, if they even had them, were covered in oiled cloth or thin horn instead of glass. So when the frost set in, your house wasn't a snug little cabin. It was more like a leaky tent with smoke inside. The hearth was the only real source of warmth. A small fire in the center or against one wall. But fires needed fuel, and fuel meant hours of gathering wood or peat. If you hadn't collected enough before the frost, you'd be spending your freezing mornings chopping or scavenging while your fingers went numb. The great food countdown, the frost signaled the closing of the food chapter. Whatever was in storage had to last until spring. Grain had to be ground, meat had to be salted or smoked, and root vegetables had to be tucked away in cool, dark places. People counted their supplies with nervous eyes. Imagine standing in your little cottage, looking at sacks of barley, a barrel of salted fish, and a pile of onions. You'd think, okay, maybe this will get us through. And then you'd glance at your hungry kids, your neighbors who might ask for help, and the chickens pecking around, and you'd sigh, knowing it probably wouldn't be enough. Bread was the daily staple, but flour ran out quickly. By the end of winter, loaves got thinner, harder, and sometimes bulked out with ground-up peas, beans, or even tree bark. Yes, bark bread was a thing when times were desperate. So the first frost was also the first reminder, better enjoy the good bread now, because it won't last. The emotional shift the first frost also had a way of sinking into people's spirits. Imagine months of warmth and sunlight, working in the fields, gossiping in the village, kids running around barefoot. Then suddenly, everyone's breath turns visible in the air. Mornings start with numb fingers, nights stretch longer, and you realize that for the next half a year, daylight will be scarce. Even though medieval people were tough, they weren't immune to the weight of the season. Winter was quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like the silence of waiting, enduring, hoping to see spring again. And the frost was the start of that long silence. Nature closes its doors. The medieval world was deeply tied to nature. The fields, rivers, and forests weren't just scenery, they were survival. When frost arrived, it felt like nature itself had slammed the door shut. Wild berries were gone, fresh greens were gone, rivers froze, and hunting grew harder, because animals either hibernated or became lean and scarce. Even fishing got tricky if the water iced over. This is why autumn festivals were so important. They weren't just celebrations. They were a last hurrah before the bleak months ahead. People feasted on whatever fresh food was left, because they knew soon it would all be dried, salted, or simply gone. The first frost meant the party was officially over. Small comforts, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. People had their ways of coping. The first frost was a reminder to bring animals closer, sometimes right into the house. Chickens, goats, and even pigs shared space with families. It sounds chaotic, and it was, but it added warmth and company. Families also drew closer together, literally. Beds were shared by parents, children, and sometimes grandparents too. Sleeping in a heap wasn't just bonding, it was survival. The frost outside might bite, but pressed together under wool blankets and rough furs, people found a little comfort. There was also a strange kind of peace to it all. With farming on pause, people slowed down. Evenings meant sitting by the fire, telling stories, or just listening to the crackle of burning wood. It was harsh, but it was also the rhythm of life. A whisper of fear still. Beneath all this, there was fear. The frost wasn't just pretty crystals on the ground. It was a messenger, saying, "Get ready. The hardest days are coming." Every family had memories of winters gone wrong. Stories of neighbors who starved, of cattle that froze, of sickness spreading through villages. The frost was beautiful, yes, but beauty in medieval life often carried a sharp edge. So when that first thin layer of ice covered the ground, people didn't smile. They braced themselves. Winter had arrived, and survival was now the main task. And that's where our story begins, not with cozy fireplaces and hot cocoa, but with the shiver of frost crawling over fields, roofs, and weary faces. The medieval winter was knocking at the door, and there was no way to keep it out. Winter clothing or lack of it today. When winter comes, we pull on fluffy coats, thermal leggings, waterproof boots, and maybe a ridiculous-looking hat with ear flaps. We've got closets stuffed with options. But in medieval times, well, let's just say, the fashion industry wasn't exactly ready for the runway at Milan. Survival came before style. And even survival wasn't guaranteed. Wool, and more wool if you lived in medieval Europe. Your winter wardrobe was basically one material: wool. Sheep were your personal fashion designers. Wool was spun, woven, and turned into tunics, cloaks, hose, and caps. It was thick, it was warm, and it was itchy. Imagine being wrapped in a scratchy blanket all day, every day. That was life. Peasants wore plain, coarse wool. Nobles got finer weaves and dyed fabrics, but wool was still the base. Linen might be worn underneath as a shirt or shift, but it didn't hold warmth on its own. Furs were added, if you could afford them, but let's be honest, unless you were wealthy, the only fur you had came from whatever small animal sneaking into your food stores. So picture yourself trudging through snow in layers of scratchy wool, maybe a patched-up cloak that had seen 10 winters already, and boots made from leather that leaked the moment you stepped in a puddle. Cozy, right. Layers were the secret weapon. The trick was layering. People piled on as many garments as possible. Undergarments of linen, a wool tunic, hose for the legs, maybe a second tunic, and then a cloak on top. Some even wrapped strips of cloth around their feet and legs like makeshift socks. But here is the problem. These clothes weren't designed with insulation science in mind. No down feathers, no synthetic linings. Once your wool got wet, you were in trouble. And wool got wet often. Medieval winters were less magical snowy wonderland and more slushy mud pits. So while peasants layered like onions, they still froze like popsicles. Cloaks. The medieval blanket cloaks were the medieval equivalent of a blanket with a clasp. You wore them during the day, you slept in them at night, and you probably used them as a towel if you fell in a river. They were multi-purpose. A long cloak could even double as a tent or sleeping bag in emergencies. The wealthy liked to line their cloaks with fur, a squirrel, rabbit, even ermine if you were royalty. Ermine cloaks became a symbol of power, because nothing says I'm important quite like wrapping yourself in dozens of tiny white animals. Meanwhile, peasants were more likely to wear a cloak that smelled faintly of sheep, and was patched with whatever fabric scraps they could find. Hats and hoods. Now let's talk headgear. Medieval people weren't walking around bareheaded in the snow. A hood, usually attached to a cloak or worn separately, was a standard winter accessory. Hoods were practical. They covered the head, neck, and sometimes part of the shoulders. Caps made of wool or felt were common too. And yes, people did wear fur hats when they could get them. But forget the fluffy pom-pom beanie. Medieval hats were about one thing: keeping your ears attached. There was even a kind of hood called a liripipe, which had a ridiculously long tail hanging down. It wasn't exactly practical for warmth, but it did make you look like you were about to join a medieval wizard convention. Shoes, a tragedy in leather shoes were, let's just say, disappointing. Most people wore leather shoes or boots that weren't waterproof and wore out quickly. They had thin soles, no insulation, and about as much protection from snow as a paper bag. If you wanted to keep your feet from freezing off, you wrapped them in cloth or stuffed straw inside your shoes for insulation. Yes, straw. Forget fancy thermal socks. Medieval peasants were basically walking scarecrows. In cold, wet weather, this system failed fast. Feet got damp, frostbite wasn't uncommon, and infections followed. Richer folk had better boots lined with fur, but even those would seem pitiful compared to your average modern winter boot. Gloves, maybe. Gloves weren't as common as you might think. For peasants, mittens might be fashioned out of wool or leather scraps. Nobles, of course, had decorated gloves, sometimes lined with fur. But for the average person, hands often went bare or were just shoved under cloaks for warmth. That's why so many winter tasks, fetching water, cutting wood, mending roofs, were miserable. Imagine chopping logs with bare, numb fingers. And if you dropped your axe, well, good luck finding it in the snow. The rich versus the poor clothing was one of the clearest signs of class difference in winter. Nobles wore layers of fine wool, velvet, and fur. Their cloaks swept the ground, lined with warm animal skins. They could afford colors too, since dyes were expensive. So while peasants shivered in brown and grey, nobles strutted in crimson and blue like they were walking fireplaces. But even the rich weren't perfectly snug. Castles were drafty, halls were freezing, and fancy fabrics didn't change the fact that medieval winters were brutal. A velvet robe looks impressive, but it doesn't help much when your chamber is icy enough to see your breath. The smell factor here is something we don't always think about. Laundry. Washing clothes in winter was almost impossible. Rivers were frozen, water was scarce, and soap was expensive. Most people simply wore their wool garments all season long without washing. Layers upon layers of sweat, smoke, and maybe the occasional goat hair. By midwinter, clothing was less about fashion and more about survival. If it smelled terrible, well, so did everyone else. At least you blended in. A world without coats, something worth pointing out. The modern coat, like a big padded jacket with buttons and sleeves, didn't really exist in early medieval Europe. Instead, it was cloaks, tunics, and layers. Coats as we know them only became common much later. So picture the medieval peasant. No snug parka, no puffy jacket, just a series of itchy blankets pinned around their body, trudging through snow with straw in their shoes. And yet, people managed, not because the clothes were great, but because they were tough, and maybe because they didn't know anything better existed. If you've never experienced a heated jacket, you won't miss it. The mental game clothing wasn't just physical protection, it was also psychological. Wrapping yourself in a cloak gave you a sense of security, even if the cold still nipped at your bones. A heavy hood pulled low over your face created a tiny bubble of warmth where you could hide from the wind. And when families huddled together under layers of wool and fur at night, it wasn't just about warmth, it was about reassurance, that feeling of being wrapped, protected, and surviving the long night together. So in the end, medieval winter fashion wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't all that effective, but it was all they had: scratchy wool, leaky leather, straw-stuffed shoes, and a cloak that doubled as your bed. The rich might have looked fancy in their furs, but everyone, rich or poor, still shivered when the frost came. The first layer of survival was clothing, and as much as medieval people bundled up, the truth was simple: the cold always found its way in. Freezing homes. When you think of winter at home today, you probably imagine cozy blankets, a warm heater humming in the background, maybe a hot drink in your hand. Now erase all of that. Imagine instead a single smoky fire, icy floors, drafty walls, and your breath fogging the air inside your own house. Welcome to the medieval home in winter. The peasant cottage. Most medieval people lived in small cottages. Picture a rectangle made of wood beams and mud plaster, with a thatched roof on top. Sounds charming, right? Like a storybook cottage. Well, the illustrations always leave out the smell of smoke, damp straw, and animal manure. When winter arrived, that cottage didn't exactly transform into a cozy ski lodge. Instead, it turned into what could only be described as a glorified fridge. The walls were thin, the roofs leaked, and the wind snuck in through every crack. Frost sometimes formed inside the house, and unless you kept a fire burning, the temperature indoors wasn't much better than outdoors. The hearth, not as warm as you think. The heart of every home was the hearth, a fireplace or even just an open pit in the center of the floor. It was the only real source of heat. Families gathered around it, cooked on it, and sometimes slept next to it. But here is the thing: one fire is not enough to heat an entire drafty building. If you were lucky enough to sit right by the flames, your front was toasty while your back froze solid. If you moved away, the cold swallowed you instantly. And fires came with problems. Wood and fuel were limited, so fires were often small and smoky. Chimneys were rare in early medieval cottages. The smoke simply drifted out through a hole in the roof, or it didn't drift at all, filling the room and making everyone's eyes water. Basically, your warm home was also a personal smokehouse. Floors of ice and mud. Forget carpets. Floors were usually packed earth, maybe covered in straw or rushes. In winter, these floors turned icy, muddy, and damp. Every time someone came in with snow on their boots, it melted, then froze again. Imagine trying to sleep while the floor beneath you slowly turned into a swampy ice patch. The straw or rushes scattered on the floor helped a little, but they also collected food scraps, animal droppings, and bugs. By midwinter, your floor covering wasn't rustic decoration. It was a crunchy, smelly mess that you probably didn't want to step on barefoot. Sleeping arrangements. Bedrooms, as we think of them, weren't really a thing for peasants. The whole family usually slept in one room, often in one bed or on straw pallets around the fire. Parents, kids, sometimes grandparents, everyone piled together under heavy wool blankets or furs. Privacy, forget it. Comfort, also forget it. But body heat was an essential survival tool. People slept in heaps like puppies just to make it through the night. And sometimes the animals joined in. Chickens might roost in a corner, goats might wander inside, and in the harshest winters, even cows or pigs could share the living space. The logic was simple: animals gave off warmth, and if you had to choose between dignity and not freezing to death, you let the pig in. Castles weren't cozy either now. You might be thinking, okay, peasants froze, but at least nobles in their castles had it better. Not really. Yes, castles were bigger, sturdier, and full of servants, but they were also giant stone refrigerators. Thick stone walls held in the cold as much as the heat. Unless you were sitting directly in front of a roaring fire in the great hall, you were shivering. Bedrooms in castles were notorious for being freezing. People used heavy drapes around beds to trap warmth. That's where the idea of the four-poster bed with curtains came from. It wasn't just fancy decoration. It was survival architecture. Without those curtains, you might as well be sleeping in an ice cave. The constant battle against drafts. One of the worst enemies of medieval winter life was the draft. No matter how many cloths you stuffed into the cracks, wind always found a way inside. Windows, if you had them, weren't glass, but oiled cloth or thin animal horn. These let in a little light, but blocked almost no cold. So, inside your home, You often had a strange combination of freezing gusts of wind mixed with choking smoke from the fire. You weren't living in a cozy cottage. You were camping indoors. Light in the darkness winter also meant long, dark nights. Without electric bulbs, people relied on candles or oil lamps. Candles were expensive, so peasants often made do with rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat. These gave a dim, smoky light and burned out quickly. So picture it, you're huddled in your freezing, smoky room, lit by a flickering fat-soaked reed that smells terrible. Not exactly the cozy glow of a modern scented candle. Smell and air quality, let's be honest. Medieval homes didn't smell great. In winter, with animals indoors, smoke filling the air, food rotting in storage, and no real ventilation, the atmosphere could be choking. People coughed constantly, eyes watered, and soot clung to everything. Children grew up in this environment, which probably explains why respiratory illnesses were so common. Your lungs worked overtime just to handle daily life. The psychological chill living in a freezing home wasn't just about physical discomfort. It wore people down mentally. Imagine waking up shivering every morning, seeing frost on the inside of the walls, and knowing that this was your reality for months. People did their best to make homes feel warmer. They decorated with cloth hangings, animal skins, and tapestries, not just for beauty, but because layers of fabric actually helped block drafts. Nobles could afford big, colorful hangings. Peasants maybe hung a tattered cloth or two and called it good. But no matter how much fabric you piled on, the cold never fully left. It lingered, a constant reminder that nature was always stronger than you. Why people endured, and yet people survived. Not because their homes were warm, but because they adapted. They layered clothes, huddled together, kept fires going as best they could, and simply accepted the misery as part of life. Home in winter wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. If you had a roof over your head, even a leaky one, you were luckier than some. And if you made it through the season with all your fingers and toes, you counted yourself blessed. So next time you complain about your heating bill or drafty windows, just remember, medieval people spent their winters living in what was basically a cold, smoky barn. Their homes didn't keep the cold out. They only made it slightly less deadly, and that was considered normal. The struggle for food, if there's one thing that makes winter hard, it's food. Today, we deal with the cold by eating comfort snacks, hot chocolate, pizza, maybe a tub of ice cream, while the heater runs. But in medieval times, food wasn't comfort. Food was survival. Every bite mattered, and every crumb had to be stretched until spring. The end of fresh food. Once the frost hit, fresh food disappeared. No vegetables in the fields, no berries in the woods, no juicy fruits. The medieval diet in winter was like hitting pause on variety. What you ate was what you managed to save from summer and autumn. That meant grains, root vegetables, dried beans, salted fish, maybe some smoked meat. If you were rich, you might have wine, spices, or preserved fruits. If you were poor, you probably stared at a lot of porridge and bread, and not fluffy white bread, heavy, dark loaves made from rye, barley, or whatever grain you could scrape together. So when the frost came, people weren't dreaming of gingerbread or Christmas cookies. They were bracing themselves for months of the same grey meals. Salt, the winter hero preserving food, was the big challenge, and salt was the hero. Meat and fish were salted heavily, then stored in barrels. This made them last, but also made them taste, well, extremely salty. If you've ever eaten jerky and thought it was too much, imagine eating it every day for months. Smoking was another method. Meat hung above fires until it dried into something resembling leather. Not delicious, but edible. In times of plenty, you might even have cheese or butter stored up, but dairy spoiled quickly unless it was hard cheese. And if you didn't have salt or smokehouses, well, you got creative. Drying, fermenting, and even burying vegetables in pits were all ways to keep food edible. Root cellars and hidden treasures. One of the most important winter tools was the root cellar. Basically a hole in the ground, lined with stone or wood, where the cool earth kept food from freezing completely and rotting too quickly. Potatoes weren't in Europe yet, but people stored turnips, onions, carrots, parsnips, cabbages, and beets. If you were lucky, you could dig out a wrinkled cabbage in February and call it a feast. It might not have looked pretty, but it kept you alive. Bread, and more bread was the backbone of medieval diets. In winter, this became even more true. Every family tried to have sacks of grain stored away for flour. The problem was, sacks ran out, and by late winter, bread got worse. When flour supplies were low, people mixed in peas, beans, oats, or chestnuts. In desperate times, ground bark or straw might even be added. Yes, tree bark bread. Not exactly something you'd find at a fancy bakery. Bread was sometimes so dense and rough that it could break a tooth. But people ate it anyway, because empty stomachs were worse than bad bread. Hunger as a constant companion. Hunger hovered over winter, unwanted guest. Even if you had food stored, you rationed it carefully. Meals were smaller, portions thinner, and every bite had to be stretched. For peasants, the idea of eating until you were full was rare in winter. More often, you ate just enough to keep going. Stomachs growled, children begged for more, and parents quietly went without to give food to their kids. Historians call the period just before spring the hungry gap, or the starving season. It was when food stores were lowest and fresh growth hadn't begun. For many families, it was the most dangerous part of the year. Meat, a rare luxury contrary to how medieval feasts are shown in movies. Most peasants hardly ate meat, especially in winter. Livestock were expensive to keep alive through the cold, since feeding them took food you needed yourself. So, many families slaughtered animals in autumn, salted the meat, and then stretched it through winter. Chickens might be kept for eggs, but if things got desperate, the chicken became soup. Cows and pigs were valuable, but in a crisis, survival came first. Nobles, of course, had more meat, venison, boar, beef, poultry, but even they had to rely on preservation. A grand roast might appear on the high table, but much of the winter diet was salted, smoked, or dried, same as the peasants. Fish Fridays and Mondays, and Wednesdays the church had strict rules about fasting days, when meat wasn't allowed. That meant fish was essential in the medieval diet, especially in winter. Salted herring was the go-to. It was cheap, it lasted, and it was available in barrels by the thousands. The problem, it was also extremely boring. Peasants ate so much herring that some historians joke entire villages must have smelled like fish. If you were lucky, you had access to freshwater fish like carp, eels, or pike. But for most, salted herring was the daily grind. Flavor. Forget it, spices were expensive, mostly reserved for the wealthy. Pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were imported luxuries. For the poor, flavor came from onions, garlic, leeks, and herbs grown in summer. Once those ran out, food turned bland fast. Imagine eating grey porridge for breakfast, grey bread for lunch, and grey stew for dinner, every day, for months. Meals weren't about taste, they were about calories, plain and simple. Alcohol to the rescue. One small comfort was drink. Ale and beer were staples, often safer than water. Cider and mead appeared too. Nobles enjoyed wine, but peasants relied on weak ale, brewed at home. It wasn't strong, but it was filling and gave a little cheer on dark, cold nights. In fact, some historians argue beer was a kind of liquid bread, a way to stretch grain supplies and provide extra energy. And let's be honest, a buzz probably helped people forget how miserable the food situation was. Sharing and stealing. Winter was also a time when community bonds were tested. Neighbors sometimes shared supplies, but hunger could also lead to theft. Grain stores were guarded carefully, because losing a sack of flour could mean disaster. Charity from the church helped a little, but resources were thin everywhere. If your harvest had failed, you often relied on the kindness of others, or you went hungry. The daily struggle. So daily life in winter revolved around food, counting it, rationing it, stretching it. Every meal was a reminder of how much, or how little, stood between your family and starvation. Peasants didn't sit down to feasts. They sat down to thin stews, hard bread, and the hope that tomorrow they'd still have enough. Nobles had it better, but even they couldn't escape the limitations of the season. Surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about warmth. It was about keeping your belly full enough to see the spring, and that was never guaranteed. Water problems. When you think about surviving winter, you probably picture running out of food or firewood. But there's another problem that medieval people faced every day: water. Today, you turn a tap, hot or cold, as much as you want. In the Middle Ages, water was something you had to fetch, carry, melt, or pray didn't make you sick. And in winter, it became a nightmare. Frozen rivers and wells. Most medieval villages relied on wells, rivers, or streams for water. In summer, that was hard enough, carrying buckets back and forth all day. But in winter, wells froze over, rivers iced up, and streams slowed to a trickle. Fetching water became an icy chore. People had to break through the ice on a river or pond, usually in the freezing morning, then carry heavy, sloshing buckets home through the snow. If you slipped, and people definitely slipped, congratulations. Now you were wet in freezing weather, which, as you can imagine, was not ideal. Even wells could freeze at the top. Villagers had to chip away at ice before lowering their buckets, and all of this just for water that wasn't even clean. Melting snow. A miserable solution, sure. You could melt snow for water, but it took forever. Imagine filling a pot with fluffy snow, putting it over a fire, and watching it shrink into a tiny puddle. You'd need mountains of snow to fill a single bucket. Plus, snow wasn't always clean. Animals walked over it, soot fell on it, and in villages, well, let's just say you didn't want to think too hard about what might be in that snowbank. So yes, snow could be melted in an emergency, but it wasn't a reliable daily source. The danger of dirty water. One of the biggest risks in medieval life was contaminated water. Wells and rivers were often polluted by animals, waste, or runoff from nearby homes. In winter, when people were desperate, they sometimes drank water they knew was bad, because there was no choice. This led to outbreaks of disease, dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, fevers. It wasn't just a cold that could kill you. It was what you drank. People understood that bad water made them sick, but they didn't know about bacteria. They just knew sometimes you got lucky, and sometimes you spent the night regretting every sip. Ale as the safer option. This is where beer and ale came to the rescue. Brewing water into ale killed some of the nastiness, thanks to boiling and fermentation. The result was a weak, low-alcohol drink that was actually safer than plain water. Even children drank it daily. So in winter, when water was scarce or suspicious, ale was the backup. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you hydrated without giving you terrible stomach cramps. Nobles drank wine if they could afford it, but peasants relied on homemade ale, brewed in small batches at home or in the village. Laundry and bathing. Forget it, water problems didn't stop at drinking. Laundry was another issue. In summer, clothes could be washed in rivers or tubs. In winter, with frozen water and icy winds, laundry was almost impossible. People basically wore the same layers for months, smoke and all. Bathing, also rare. Heating enough water to wash your body meant hours of work chopping wood, fetching buckets, and boiling pots. Most people just didn't bother in winter. A quick splash on the face, maybe a rinse of hands if water was handy, but full baths were left for special occasions, or just warmer weather. So yes, everyone smelled. But since everyone smelled equally bad, nobody complained. Water for animals, don't forget. It wasn't just humans who needed water. Animals, cows, pigs, chickens, horses, all needed it too. Keeping them hydrated in freezing weather was another daily struggle. Farmers broke ice on ponds for livestock, or lugged buckets from wells. A thirsty cow could drink gallons a day, so imagine hauling that much water back and forth, with numb fingers, in the snow. Some farmers melted snow for their animals, but again, it was slow, tedious, and fuel hungry. If water ran low, animals grew weak, and weak animals meant less milk, fewer eggs, and eventually less food for humans. It was a chain reaction of misery. Carrying the weight fetching water was exhausting. Buckets were heavy, especially wooden ones filled to the brim. Many people used yokes, wooden bars carried across the shoulders, with buckets hanging from either end. Even then, it was back-breaking work. And remember, this wasn't a quick chore. Families needed water daily for drinking, cooking, animals, and sometimes even brewing. Every day, someone trudged through the cold, broke ice, filled buckets, and staggered home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. Winter accidents carrying water also came with hazards. Roads and paths turned slippery with ice and snow. People slipped, spilled, and sometimes fell badly. A broken bone in winter was a serious problem, not only because of the injury, but because it meant someone else had to take on your water-fetching duties. Children often helped, but even they struggled with the weight. Water duty was shared across the household, because nobody could afford to skip it. The rich had problems too. Even in castles, water was a challenge. Nobles had servants to fetch and carry, but the problems of freezing wells and icy rivers were the same. Some castles had cisterns or water systems, but these could freeze in harsh winters. Servants lugged buckets up endless stairs, sweating under the weight, while nobles sat by the fire. Bathing for nobles was slightly easier. Tubs were brought into warm rooms, filled with buckets of hot water by exhausted servants. But this was still rare, more of a treat than a routine. Water remained a chore, no matter how high your status. Survival by habit in the end. Medieval people survived winter water problems the same way they survived everything else, by routine, toughness, and low expectations. Water wasn't clean, baths weren't common, and the chore never ended. But people adapted. They boiled when they could, brewed ale when possible, and made peace with the fact that in winter, water was always a little harder to get and a lot less pleasant to use. So next time you take a hot shower on a freezing day, just remember, a medieval peasant would have considered that pure magic. For them, water in winter was heavy, cold, and often unsafe. But without it, life simply couldn't go on. Fires and fuel. There was one thing medieval people needed more than food in the winter. It was fire, not just for warmth, but for cooking, boiling water, brewing ale, drying clothes, and sometimes even keeping animals alive. Fire was life, but getting enough fuel to keep it going, that was the hard part. The constant hunger for heat. Imagine your medieval cottage in January. Outside, the snow is piled against the door. Inside, your fire is down to a few glowing embers. Without more wood, the room will quickly turn into a walk-in freezer. And unlike today, where you can flip a switch and enjoy central heating, medieval warmth depended on you having a steady supply of fuel. That meant wood, peat, or in some cases, even dried animal dung. Whatever burned, people used it. The fire wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Without it, food couldn't be cooked, water couldn't be thawed, and everyone risked freezing through the night. Firewood. The peasants' burden. The most common fuel was firewood, but wood wasn't free, even in a time when forests seemed endless. Many peasants didn't actually own the woods around their village. Those belonged to the local lord. Gathering wood without permission could be considered theft, so peasants were often limited to collecting fallen branches, twigs, or deadwood. Cutting down a living tree without rights could earn you fines or worse. And hauling wood was back-breaking work, chopping, stacking, and dragging heavy logs home through the cold. Even if you had the rights, wood had to be gathered in summer and left to dry. Fresh, green wood smoked terribly and gave off little heat, so a smart household had piles stacked months ahead. A not-so-smart household shivered and coughed in a cloud of smoke. Peat. Burning the earth in regions with fewer trees, people dug up peat. Basically compacted, muddy plant matter cut from bogs, dried into bricks. Peat burned slowly and gave off steady heat. It wasn't as hot as wood, but it was easier to gather if you lived near a bog. Peat fires also smelled, let's just say, unique. Some described it as earthy. Others said it was like burning mud. But when it's freezing outside, you don't care if your house smells like a swamp fire. You care that your toes aren't falling off. Dung fires, yes, it's exactly what you think. In places with little wood or peat, dried animal dung was collected and used as fuel. Cow dung, horse dung, sheep dung, once dried in the sun. It made a surprisingly efficient fire. Was it pleasant? No. Did it keep people alive? Yes. And if you lived in a treeless plain, dung fires were the difference between freezing or surviving. How fires were managed keeping a fire going wasn't just about piling on fuel. People had to tend flames constantly. Starting a fire from scratch took time and skill. No matches, no lighters. So households often kept a small fire smouldering all night, banking the coals with ashes to preserve heat until morning. If the fire went out completely, you might need to borrow embers from a neighbor. Yes, borrowing fire was a real thing. People would carry hot coals home in pots, praying they didn't drop them in the snow. Smoke-filled homes. The problem with medieval fires wasn't just keeping them lit. It was dealing with the smoke. Poor cottages often had no chimney, just a hole in the roof. The result? Rooms filled with choking, eye-watering smoke. Everything smelled like smoke. Clothes, bedding, hair, food. Visitors might cough their way through dinner, but nobody was surprised. That was just how homes were in winter. And while smoky fires were unpleasant, they did have one hidden benefit. The smoke helped keep insects away and even preserved hanging meat. Still, most people would have preferred a chimney. Fires and food. Without fire, food was useless. Bread had to be baked, porridge had to be boiled, and meat had to be roasted or stewed. In winter, cold food was not just unappetizing, it was dangerous. Uncooked meat carried risks, and icy porridge was, well, disgusting. So fires worked double duty, heating homes and making food edible. A family's daily rhythm often revolved around stoking the hearth, cooking over it, and keeping it alive for the next day. The rich had bigger fires, of course. Nobles lived differently. Castles had massive hearths, roaring fires, and whole teams of servants to chop and haul wood. Banquet halls could be kept warm with giant fires big enough to roast entire animals. But even in castles, fires couldn't heat everything. Stone walls stayed icy, and drafty rooms were common. Nobles often carried small braziers, portable pans of hot coals, to warm their hands. They also wore layers of fur indoors. So yes, nobles were warmer than peasants, but they weren't living in tropical comfort either. Winter was harsh for everyone. Fire hazards. There was a darker side to medieval fires. Danger. Houses made of timber and thatch could easily catch fire if sparks flew. In crowded towns, one stray ember could set off a chain reaction that destroyed dozens of homes. This meant people were careful, but accidents still happened. Fire was both a blessing and a constant threat. It was the one thing you couldn't live without, but also feared losing control of. The endless chore. What all this meant is that tending the fire was a non-stop chore. Someone always had to feed it, watch it, gather fuel, or cook over it. It never ended. Winter nights especially were a test. Imagine sitting by the fire, dozing off, only to wake and realize the flames are dying. Do you get up, shiver across the room, and throw on more wood? Or do you risk sleeping and waking up in a freezing room? For medieval families, the fire was like another member of the household, demanding, needy, and always hungry. Survival by flame. In the end, surviving winter was really surviving with fire. It meant having enough fuel, enough patience, and enough luck to keep the flames alive through the long, cold months. A warm hearth was the center of family life. People gathered around it to talk, eat, repair clothes, or simply thaw their hands. It was the difference between misery and something like comfort. So, when you picture a medieval winter night, don't imagine cozy cottages with cheery fires. Imagine smoky rooms, scarce fuel, and a fire that never quite felt big enough. But for the people living there, that fire, however small, was life itself. Illness in the cold, If freezing to death wasn't enough to worrying about, medieval winters brought another enemy: sickness. The cold months were like a festival of germs, coughs, and fevers, and since medicine at the time was more about hope than science, people had to endure illness with little more than prayers, potions, and piles of blankets. Cold homes, cold bodies. The first thing to remember is that medieval houses weren't exactly designed for health. Drafts blew through the walls, smoke filled the rooms, and dampness clung to everything. Sleeping in a smoky, chilly room with damp straw bedding was basically asking for lung problems, so it's no surprise that coughs and chest infections were common. Today, we'd say stay warm and take some antibiotics. Back then, advice was more like try drinking boiled herbs and avoid angry spirits. Spoiler: it didn't work very well. The usual suspects: colds and fevers. Winter brought the classic colds and flus, runny noses, sore throats, shivers, all the usual suspects. Except medieval people didn't know about viruses. They thought sickness came from bad air, imbalanced humors, or maybe even divine punishment. A bad fever could knock out an entire household. If one person caught something, chances were the rest of the family soon did too. And since everyone was huddled together in one smoky room, germs spread fast. Crowding equals contagion. Winter meant people stayed indoors more often. Families, neighbors, sometimes even animals, all packed into small spaces for warmth. Great for sharing stories, not so great for sharing diseases. Imagine a family of 6, plus a goat and a few chickens, all sleeping in the same cottage. One sneeze, and suddenly everyone's down with a cough that lasts 4 weeks. In towns, things were even worse. Crowded houses, dirty streets, and poor sanitation meant infections spread like wildfire. Winter was basically flu season, medieval edition. Deadly illnesses. Some sicknesses were mild, but others were killers. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis. These thrived in the cold months. Without modern medicine, a chest infection that today might mean a course of pills could easily mean death back then. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. A cough that lingered too long could turn into something much worse. Many families dreaded winter because it often meant losing someone. Home remedies. But medieval people didn't just give up. They tried all sorts of remedies, some surprisingly clever, others less so. Herbal teas, boiled herbs like thyme, sage, or chamomile, thought to ease coughs. Honey, used to soothe throats, and honestly, still not a bad idea. Hot stones, wrapped in cloth and placed on the chest to ease breathing. Odd cures, rubbing onions on the skin, carrying charms, or sleeping with a piece of iron under the pillow. Did these work? Sometimes. Mostly they gave comfort, which is better than nothing. Hunger and weakness. Another reason sickness was so bad in winter. Weak bodies. By February or March, food stores were running low. Diets shrank to dried bread, thin porridge, or whatever scraps were left. Malnutrition made people more likely to get sick and less able to recover. So winter illness wasn't just about catching a cold. It was about catching a cold while your body was already exhausted, underfed, and freezing. Not exactly a recipe for recovery. Work through the pain. Most peasants couldn't afford to rest when sick. Animals still needed feeding. Water still needed carrying. Fire still needed tending. Unless you were completely bedridden, you worked through the coughs and fevers. That meant people didn't recover as fast, and sometimes sickness dragged on 4 months. But survival demanded it. If you stopped working, the household could starve or freeze. Superstitions about illness. As with most things, sickness in the Middle Ages came wrapped in superstition. Some believed winter illnesses were caused by evil spirits slipping in through the cold air. Others thought it was punishment for sins. People wore charms, prayed to saints, or visited local healers. Priests might bless the sick, while wise women prescribed herbs. And if all else failed, people simply hoped spring would come before the sickness grew worse. The rich had doctors. Sort of nobles had slightly better chances, since they could afford physicians. But medieval doctors didn't exactly have a great track record. They followed ancient theories about humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, they thought one humour was out of balance. Treatment often involved bloodletting, purges, or bizarre concoctions. Did it cure illness? Usually not. Sometimes it made things worse. But at least nobles had access to warm rooms and better food, which gave them an advantage over peasants. Winter deaths. Oddly, many illnesses in winter proved fatal. Parish records from medieval Europe often show spikes in deaths during the coldest months. For families, it wasn't just the cold and hunger that made winter frightening. It was the constant shadow of sickness. Children especially had low survival rates in harsh winters. For many parents, the season meant holding their breath and hoping everyone made it through alive. Survival mindset. Despite all this, medieval people endured. They accepted illness as a part of life, just as they accepted hunger, cold, and hard work. Communities supported one another where they could, with neighbors sharing remedies or food. Faith played a huge role too. Prayers, rituals, and church support gave people comfort when cures didn't. And when spring finally arrived, the return of fresh air, sunlight, and new food often brought a burst of energy and recovery. Life, smoke, and coughs. So when you picture a medieval winter, don't just think of snow and firelight. Think of smoky rooms filled with coughing families, herbal teas bubbling over the fire, and the constant hope that an illness wouldn't turn deadly. In many ways, sickness was as much a part of winter as the cold itself, and surviving it took resilience, luck, and the ability to keep going, even when your body was begging for rest. Animals in winter. When we think about medieval survival, it's easy to picture peasants huddled by smoky fires, struggling with cold and hunger. But they weren't alone in this battle. Their animals, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, horses, and chickens, also had to make it through the brutal season. And if the animals didn't survive, neither did the people. Animals equals survival in a medieval village. Animals weren't just cute companions. They were food, clothing, labor, and survival rolled into one. Cows gave milk, sheep gave wool, chickens gave eggs, pigs gave, well, bacon. Horses and oxen plowed fields, carried goods, and hauled firewood. So when winter arrived, keeping animals alive was just as important as keeping people alive. In many ways, it was harder. Where did the animals go? During summer, animals grazed in fields and forests. In winter, grass vanished under snow, and the world turned barren. So animals had to be brought closer to the home. Cows and sheep often stayed in barns or sheds. But here is the fun part. Sometimes the animals actually shared the same living space as the humans. Yes, really. In poor cottages, families and animals might sleep under the same roof. Why? 2 reasons: warmth and safety. Animals produced body heat, like living furnaces, and keeping them inside meant wolves or thieves were less likely to steal them during the night. Cozy, yes. Smelly, absolutely. Feeding the herd. Feeding animals in winter was one of the biggest challenges. Farmers had to prepare during the summer by cutting hay, storing grain, and preserving fodder. If you didn't make enough, your animals starved. And starving animals meant less milk, less wool, and fewer eggs. Cows were given hay and whatever scraps could be spared. Sheep often ate dried grass or turnips. Chickens survived on grain, if there was any left, or by pecking at kitchen waste. Pigs ate just about anything, which was convenient, but they were usually fattened and slaughtered before winter rather than fed through it. By February, many households were running dangerously low on feed. Animals grew thin, milk dried up, and sometimes desperate farmers had to cull their livestock to save the rest. The role of dung animals weren't just mouths to feed. They also provided one of the most important resources of all: dung. Yes, dung again. Dried cow or horse dung was used as fuel when wood was scarce. Animal waste also fertilized fields for spring planting. In other words, even poop was precious. Medieval life really didn't waste anything. So feeding animals through winter wasn't just about survival now. It was an investment in the coming year's crops and fuel supply. Illness in animals cold, damp barns weren't exactly healthy places. Just as humans caught coughs and fevers, animals got sick in winter too. Cows developed lung infections, sheep got weak, and chickens stopped laying eggs. Veterinary care, of course, was primitive. Farmers relied on folk remedies, herbs mixed into feed, poultices, or prayers. Sometimes they worked. Often they didn't. Losing animals in winter was devastating, since it meant less food and fewer resources for spring. Animals as company, while animals were mostly valued for practical reasons, they also gave companionship during the long, dark months. A cow in the barn or a dog by the fire was company as much as a resource. Chickens clucking in a corner or cats hunting mice added life to otherwise quiet cottages. It wasn't modern pets, but people still formed bonds. A good working horse or a loyal dog was cherished. In hard winters, families sometimes went hungry rather than slaughter a favorite animal too soon. Horses and travel horses and oxen were especially vital in winter. Roads turned into icy messes, but goods still needed hauling and firewood still needed transporting. Horses were fed oats if families could spare them, but often they had to make do with straw and hay. Thin, weary horses struggling through snow was a common sight, but without them, villages couldn't function. So caring for the animals wasn't just kindness, it was pure necessity. When desperation hit sometimes, food ran out, for humans and animals alike. And when that happened, animals turned from companions into food. Chickens, goats, sheep, and even cows could be slaughtered in lean times. It was a brutal reality. Families tried to preserve their breeding stock, but in truly desperate winters, survival meant hard choices. Eating an animal might mean you lived another week, but it also meant fewer resources next year. These choices weighed heavily on families, and stories of winters where whole herds were wiped out are common in medieval records. The rich and their stables, of course. Nobles had it easier. Their castles included large stables, barns, and stores of hay. Servants kept horses fed and cows milked. Nobles enjoyed fresh meat and milk long after peasants had run out. But even noble animals could suffer in harsh winters. Disease spread quickly in crowded stables, and even wealthy lords sometimes faced shortages if the season dragged on. No one escaped winter completely. Spring equals relief by March or April. Animals and humans alike were thin and weary. When grass finally returned, herds were led out eagerly to graze. The relief was enormous. Milk flowed again, sheep fattened, and chickens returned to laying. Surviving the winter with most animals intact was a victory. Losing too many could cripple a family for years. Animals weren't just food, they were the foundation of medieval survival. Life with hooves and feathers. So when you picture a medieval winter cottage, remember it wasn't just humans huddled by the fire. It was cows lowing in the barn, sheep bleating outside, chickens scratching in the straw, and maybe even a pig snoring in the corner. The animals suffered alongside their owners, but they also gave warmth, food, and hope. Without them, life would have been impossible. Winter work and idleness. When you imagine medieval winters, you might picture everyone stuck indoors, shivering, waiting for spring to save them. And that's partly true. But people still had work to do, even when fields were frozen and snow piled high. At the same time, winter also forced people to slow down, creating rare moments of rest and, dare we say, boredom. The fields go quiet. The biggest change in winter was the silence of the fields. Farming was the backbone of medieval life, but once the ground froze, plows were useless, seeds couldn't be sown, weeds didn't grow, and crops wouldn't sprout. This didn't mean farming stopped completely. Farmers still tended to stored grain, checked fences, and worried about spring planting, but the intense, back-breaking work of digging, sowing, and harvesting paused. For peasants who spent every summer and fall bent over fields, winter was the only time their bodies got a break from endless labor. Chores never ended, of course. Rest didn't mean lounging in bed all day. There were still endless chores. Firewood had to be chopped, water hauled, and animals cared for. Families repaired tools, mended clothes, and patched leaking roofs. Winter was also the season of spinning and weaving. Women sat by the fire turning wool into yarn, or yarn into cloth, making clothes for the coming year. Men sharpened plough blades, fixed carts, and carved wooden handles. So while the fields were asleep, households stayed busy, keeping everything else in working order. Work indoors. Winter pushed people indoors, which meant a shift to crafts and handiwork. In villages, blacksmiths still hammered metal, carpenters built furniture, and weavers made cloth. These indoor trades became the backbone of winter labor. For many, this was the season of small-scale industry. Families made candles, tanned leather, brewed ale, or crafted simple tools. Even children helped with spinning, sewing, or fetching supplies. Idleness was frowned upon. In a world where survival balanced on a knife's edge, everyone had to contribute, even when snow fell outside. Passing the time still, there were moments when work slowed down. Winter days were short and nights were long. After chores were done and fires were stoked, families often gathered around the hearth. They told stories, sang songs, and played simple games. Children might carve toys from wood scraps. Adults might gossip, plan for spring, or share local legends. For many, it was the only season where evenings felt a little less frantic. Was it cozy? Sometimes. Was it boring? Definitely. But in a world of endless labor, even boredom was a luxury. Festivals and breaks. The church calendar gave peasants occasional breaks during winter. Christmas, Epiphany, and Carnival all punctuated the dark season with feasting and merriment. Work eased during these times, giving communities a chance to relax and celebrate. So while winter felt endless, it wasn't all gloom. Moments of joy and laughter lit up the cold months, even if they were rare and short-lived. For the nobles, winter work looked different. For nobles, they didn't have to hold water or chop wood themselves, but they weren't entirely idle either. Lords managed estates, heard disputes, and planned spring campaigns or hunts. Castles buzzed with activity. Servants cooked, cleaned, and kept fires burning. Ladies of the house spun fine thread, embroidered clothing, and organized supplies. Knights trained indoors or polished weapons. So even the wealthy had winter work, though it was a lot warmer and far less backbreaking than peasant chores. Danger of too much idleness. There's an old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Medieval people believed too much laziness was sinful. Priests reminded villagers that even in winter, they should work or pray rather than waste time. So while winter slowed the pace, people found tasks to fill the hours. Whether it was mending clothes or reciting prayers, idleness was carefully avoided. The boredom of darkness. One thing you can't escape in winter is darkness. With the sun setting early, evenings stretched long, candles and rushlights were expensive, so most families relied on firelight alone. That meant activities had to stop once it grew to dim, so people went to bed early, sometimes right after supper, simply because there was nothing else to do. Sleep became a way to pass the time until morning light returned. Boredom may not sound dramatic, but in a medieval world of constant labor, it was almost unsettling. Too much free time made people restless. Winter equals a test of patience in the end. Winter work and idleness balanced each other. People couldn't work the fields, but they couldn't sit around either. Chores, crafts, and survival tasks kept them busy, while the long nights brought an unusual mix of boredom and togetherness. For peasants, it was a time to mend, plan, and hope supplies lasted. For nobles, it was a chance to train, feast, or manage estates. Everyone, high or low, was simply waiting for the return of spring. Life between busy and bored. So when you picture medieval winter life, don't just imagine endless misery. Yes, people froze, worked, and worried, but they also rested, told stories, and enjoyed rare moments of quiet. Winter was strange that way, both the busiest and slowest season, a time of hard chores and unexpected stillness. For many, it was the only time the relentless pace of farming paused long enough to catch a breath, even if that breath was clouded with smoke and frost. Festivals and feasts. Winter may have been brutal, but it wasn't all shivering, coughing, and eating stale bread. In between the misery, there were bright sparks of joy, festivals and feasts. These were the times when people could forget the cold for a while, come together, eat something special, and celebrate. In a season that often felt endless, festivals gave medieval folks a reason to keep going. The importance of celebration life in the Middle Ages revolved around the church calendar, and winter was dotted with holy days that doubled as excuses to rest and eat. Celebrations broke up the monotony of cold months, turning grim days into something memorable. They weren't just about fun, either. Feasts reminded people of community, faith, and the promise that spring would eventually return. In a way, they were survival tools for the spirit. Christmas, the big one, the biggest winter celebration, of course, was Christmas. Today we imagine cozy fires, carols, and presents. In medieval times, Christmas was more about feasting, fasting beforehand, and attending church. For peasants, Christmas meant rare treats, meat, spiced ale, maybe even sweet cakes if the village was lucky. Lords sometimes hosted great feasts for tenants, showing generosity during the hardest season. Decorations were simple but symbolic: holly, ivy, and evergreen branches, reminders of life during the dead of winter. Candles glowed in churches, and carols filled the air. For a brief moment, the cold and hunger seemed to fade. Yule and old traditions before Christianity. Northern Europe celebrated Yule, a midwinter festival that lingered in customs. Bonfires were lit, logs were burned, and people drank to drive away the darkness. The famous Yule log comes from these traditions. A giant log burned slowly through the night, symbolizing warmth and hope. Even after Christianization, many Yule traditions blended into Christmas celebrations. So while peasants prayed in church, they might also tell old stories by the fire, drink heavily, and enjoy games passed down from pagan times. Epiphany and Twelfth Night Christmas celebrations didn't end on December 25th. They stretched on 4 days, leading up to Epiphany in early January. This period was full of feasting, singing, and socializing. Twelfth Night, the final evening of the Christmas season, was especially rowdy. In some places, a lord of misrule was chosen, someone appointed to oversee games, dances, and general mischief. For one night, the world turned upside down. Peasants teased nobles, servants mocked masters, and everyone enjoyed a bit of chaos before returning to normal life. Carnival before Lent. Another burst of celebration came just before Lent, usually in February. Carnival was a last chance to indulge in food and fun before the long season of fasting and prayer. People ate heartily, drank deeply, and often dressed in costumes. Dancing, music, and even playful mocking of authority were common. It was wild, messy, and joyful, a much-needed break before weeks of going without meat, dairy, and other luxuries. Feasting in hard times, of course. Not every festival meant abundance. Sometimes, winter supplies were already running low, but communities still scraped together what they could, sharing in small feasts even if it was just extra bread, stew, and ale. The act of feasting itself, of coming together and eating more than usual, mattered more than the menu. It reminded people that life wasn't just about survival. Lords and lavish feasts for nobles. Festivals were grand spectacles. Castles echoed with music and laughter as tables groaned under roasted meats, pies, fruits, and wine. Entertainment included minstrels, jugglers, and even small plays. The feasts weren't just about pleasure. They displayed wealth and power. A generous lord earned loyalty, while stingy nobles risked looking weak. So while peasants nibbled on extra porridge, lords were enjoying swan, venison, and sweet pastries. The difference between rich and poor was never clearer than during festival feasts. Games and merriment. Food wasn't the only highlight of festivals. Games and entertainment were everywhere. Villagers played dice, sang carols, or danced in circles. In some places, people went wassailing, singing door to door in exchange for food or drink, kind of like a medieval caroling meets trick or treat. Masks and costumes were popular too, adding mystery and humor to celebrations. And of course, there was plenty of drinking. Ale, beer, wine, whatever was available flowed freely, warming cold bodies and lifting weary spirits. The role of the church, while feasts and festivals brought fun, they were also deeply tied to religion. Every major celebration had a spiritual core, reminding people of faith and community. Church services were packed, hymns rang out, and prayers filled the air. This gave the celebrations a sense of meaning. People weren't just partying, they were reaffirming their place in the world and their hope for divine protection through the harsh winter. Light in the darkness festivals mattered because they brought light into the darkest time of year. Imagine endless grey days, freezing nights, and dwindling food. Now imagine a hall filled with music, laughter, and the smell of roasting meat. That contrast made festivals feel magical. For many, memories of winter weren't just about hunger and hardship. They were also about those rare nights when the whole community came together. Bellies were full, and joy filled the air. Feasting as survival might sound strange, but festivals helped people survive winter emotionally. They gave people something to look forward to, a break from the grind of hauling water and chopping wood. A single feast could recharge the spirit, making the cold months feel a little more bearable. Without these bursts of celebration, winter would have been endless misery. With them, it became a season not only of hardship, but also of hope. A toast to survival. So, when you think about medieval winters, don't just imagine smoke-filled cottages and icy roads. Remember the echoes of laughter during Christmas, the chaos of Twelfth Night, and the wild joy of Carnival. For a season known for suffering, medieval winter also gave people moments of warmth, both in the belly and in the heart. Festivals were proof that even in the coldest, darkest times, humans will always find a reason to feast, sing, and celebrate life. Travel in the snow. If you think driving in winter traffic today is bad, try traveling in the Middle Ages, without heated cars, paved roads, or GPS. Moving around in winter was one of the hardest, most dangerous things people had to do. Whether it was a farmer trudging to market or a noble trying to ride to another castle, travel in the snow was slow, uncomfortable, and sometimes deadly. Roads that weren't really roads. Let's start with the basics. Medieval roads were often just dirt paths. In summer, they were dusty. In spring and autumn, they turned into mud pits. And in winter, well, imagine mud, but frozen solid and sprinkled with ice. Some roads were made of stone, especially old Roman ones, but most had crumbled by the Middle Ages. So travelers usually faced uneven, slippery tracks that made walking or riding a nightmare. Walking in winter, the simplest way to travel was on foot, but trudging through snow in thin leather shoes or boots stuffed with straw was exhausting. Clothes soaked easily, and frostbite was a real danger. Villagers still had to walk to church, to the mill, to a neighbor's cottage, but long journeys on foot in winter were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Horses, carts, and slush riding a horse helped, but it wasn't always better. Horses slipped on icy paths, stumbled in deep snow, and could collapse from exhaustion. Carts were even worse. Wooden wheels sank in mud or got stuck in snowdrifts. For this reason, most people didn't even bother with carts in the coldest months. Goods were carried on pack animals or on people's own backs. Frozen rivers, shortcuts, and risks. Interestingly, frozen rivers sometimes became highways. When ice was thick enough, people used it as a shortcut for sleds, carts, or even walking. But that was risky. Ice could crack, plunging travelers into freezing water. One wrong step, and what looked like a smooth shortcut became a deadly trap. Danger on the road. Travel in winter was never safe. Bandits didn't take holidays just because it was cold. In fact, snow sometimes made ambushes easier, since travelers had fewer paths to choose from. Wolves and other wild animals also roamed closer to roads in harsh winters, searching for food. A hungry pack of wolves could easily overwhelm an unlucky traveler. Then there was the simple danger of exposure. A journey that took hours in summer might take days in winter. Without enough food, warmth, or shelter, People froze before reaching their destination. Inns and hospitality. Because of these dangers, travelers relied on inns, monasteries, or the kindness of strangers. Monasteries especially were known for offering food and shelter to weary wanderers. Still, medieval inns weren't cozy hotels. Picture smoky rooms, straw beds, and lots of snoring strangers. But compared to sleeping in a snowbank, it felt like luxury. Merchants and markets for merchants. Winter travel was sometimes unavoidable. Villages still needed salt, cloth, tools, and other goods. So merchants trudged along icy roads with wagons or pack animals, hoping to make it to market towns without freezing or being robbed. Markets themselves were lively even in winter. Picture stalls surrounded by snow, vendors stamping their feet to stay warm, and shoppers clutching cloaks as they bargained for food or firewood. Nobles on the move for the wealthy. Winter travel was more organized. Nobles rode in carriages or on horseback, accompanied by servants and guards. They had furs, blankets, and sometimes even heated stones to keep warm. But even a noble procession could get bogged down in mud or snow. Horses slipped, wheels broke, and journeys stretched much longer than planned. Comfort only went so far when the road itself was miserable. Pilgrims in winter, another group, often on the road in winter, were pilgrims. Religious devotion didn't stop for snow. Some traveled to shrines, hoping for healing or blessings. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, carrying staffs and bundles of food. Many relied on monasteries for shelter, but for every pilgrim who reached their destination, some lightly froze, fell ill, or simply gave up and turned back. Staying put was safer, because travel was so difficult. Most people just stayed put in winter. Villagers rarely left their communities unless it was urgent. Nobles delayed long journeys until spring. Merchants reduced their routes. Winter was not the season for adventure. It was the season for hunkering down and surviving. Imagine the journey to really picture medieval winter travel. Imagine this. You leave home at dawn, wrapped in itchy wool, your boots crunching snow. The wind bites your face, your stomach growls, and your water flask has frozen solid. You walk 4 hours, slipping, shivering, and constantly scanning for danger. By nightfall, you find shelter in a smoky inn, where you share a bed with 2 strangers and wake up with straw stuck to your clothes. That was travel. Miserable, slow, but sometimes necessary. Travel as a test of endurance in the end. Winter journeys were less about reaching a destination and more about enduring the process. Every step tested patience, strength, and luck. So next time, learn about a delayed winter flight or a car stuck in traffic. Remember, medieval travelers, at least you're not dragging a cart through knee-deep snow while wolves howl in the distance. A world on pause. Ultimately, medieval winter slowed everything down. Roads were nearly impassable, journeys took forever, and danger lurked everywhere. Communities became isolated, cut off until spring thawed the land. Travel in the snow was possible, but it was miserable, and most people, given the choice, simply stayed home, dreaming of the day when roads were clear again. Social life in the cold, when the world outside turned white and frozen. Medieval people leaned more than ever on each other. Winter was too harsh to face alone, so community ties, gossip, and shared fires became survival tools just as important as food and fuel. Social life didn't stop in the cold. If anything, it got louder, smokier, and a bit more crowded. The village as a winter bubble. Most peasants lived in small villages, and winter turned these into little bubbles of survival. With travel dangerous and roads blocked, people rarely saw anyone beyond their own settlement. That meant neighbors became your entire world. You borrowed tools, shared food, and helped each other patch roofs or dig paths through snow. If one family ran out of wood, another might lend some, knowing they'd need help later themselves. In winter, survival wasn't just about what you had, it was also about who you knew. Huddling by the hearth was the center of medieval social life, especially in winter. Families gathered around smoky fires to eat, talk, and stay warm. Visitors were welcomed, partly out of kindness, partly because more bodies meant more heat. Evenings stretched long, so people filled them with stories, songs, and games. Children might hear folk tales, while adults swapped news or told ghost stories fit for dark nights. The hearth wasn't just for warmth, it was the medieval version of TV, radio, and social media all rolled into one. Gossip as entertainment. When you're stuck inside 4 months, gossip becomes entertainment. Who quarreled at market? Whose cow wandered into the wrong field? Which neighbor had suspiciously nice boots after claiming to be broke? Gossip was a way to pass the time, but it was also a way to keep the community in check. Reputation mattered in small villages, and winter gossip could sting as sharply as the cold. Taverns and alehouses. If people wanted more lively company, they headed to the tavern. Even in winter, alehouses stayed busy. Villagers crowded into smoky rooms, nursing mugs of ale, swapping stories, and singing rowdy songs. Taverns weren't just for fun, they were community hubs. Deals were struck, disputes settled, and news spread. In a world without newspapers, a night at the tavern was the best way to catch up on what was happening beyond the village. And yes, ale helped keep people warm, or at least made them care a little less about the cold. Church as a social anchor. The church remained at the center of community life in winter. People gathered there for Sunday services, holy days, and festivals. Beyond religion, the church provided a place for neighbors to meet, trade news, and see each other. Monasteries sometimes offered food and shelter to those in need. So the church wasn't just about prayer. It was about survival and solidarity. Winter weddings and gatherings. Believe it or not, winter was sometimes chosen for weddings. With farming on pause, people actually had more time to celebrate. A winter wedding meant days of feasting, music, and dancing, which broke the monotony of the season. Other gatherings also took place: communal meals, small fairs, and celebrations tied to the church calendar. Winter may have been harsh, but people found excuses to come together. Music, games, and laughter. Entertainment was simple but heartfelt. Villagers played dice games, told riddles, or sang ballads. Fiddles, drums, and bagpipes added music to gatherings, filling the air with life despite the cold. Children invented games with whatever they had: rolling hoops, carving toys, or even sliding on frozen ponds. Adults joined in too, proving that play was as important as work when spirits needed lifting. Sharing stories. Winter nights were perfect for storytelling. Myths, legends, and folk tales passed from generation to generation around the fire. Heroes, saints, and tricksters filled the imagination while winds howled outside. Some stories carried warnings, reminding listeners about the dangers of greed, laziness, or wandering into the woods alone. Others were just for laughs, proving that humor survived even in the darkest months. Nobles and courtly life. Social life for the wealthy looked different, of course. In castles, nobles hosted feasts, dances, and hunts. Troubadours sang, jesters entertained, and knights practiced indoor games or storytelling contests. Castles could feel crowded in winter, with servants, soldiers, and guests packed inside. But they also buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the quiet struggles of peasant cottages. Helping and surviving together. Winter tested communities. Families that hoarded too much risked resentment, while those who shared earned loyalty. Helping a neighbor in need wasn't just kind, it was insurance. Someday, you might need help yourself. That mutual support created bonds that carried villages through the darkest months. In many ways, winter wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about surviving together. A season of togetherness. So, while medieval winter was filled with misery, it also brought people closer. Families huddled at the hearth. Neighbors shared tools and gossip. Villagers crowded into taverns, churches, and feasts. The cold outside was bitter, but inside, communities built warmth out of laughter, songs, and shared stories. In the end, social life in the cold wasn't just a distraction, it was a lifeline, proof that even in the harshest winters, people could still find comfort in each other's company. Winter for the rich versus the poor. Not all medieval winters were suffered equally. The season of frost and hunger hit peasants and nobles very differently. While the poor huddled in drafty cottages, nobles feasted in stone castles. But don't get too jealous. Even the rich couldn't escape every winter misery. Let's look at how the two halves of society experienced the cold months. Life in a cottage for peasants. Winter meant surviving in a simple wooden or wattle and daub cottage. These homes were small, smoky, and barely insulated. Drafts crept through cracks, and snow sometimes blew straight inside. The hearth provided the only heat, but with scarce firewood, families often rationed flames. Everyone slept in the same room, piling together under scratchy blankets and animal furs. Sometimes animals were brought inside for extra warmth, which was cozy, but also smelly. Meals were plain: bread, thin stews, maybe salted fish or pork if supplies lasted. The poor lived with constant hunger, hoping their stored grain didn't run out before spring. Life in a castle now. Picture the nobles in their castles. On the surface, they had it far better. Fires roared in great halls, servants kept food flowing, and furs lined their clothes. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, spiced wine, and sweet pastries. Entertainment included music, dances, and games. But castles weren't as cozy as they sound. Stone walls held the cold, and vast rooms were hard to heat. Even nobles often wore layers of fur indoors, and tapestries on walls weren't just decoration, they were insulation. So yes, lords and ladies had more comfort, but they weren't exactly sipping hot cocoa in a snug living room. Hunger versus abundance. The greatest divide was food. For peasants, winter diet shrank to bread, porridge, and whatever could be salted or dried. Meat was rare. Malnutrition was common. By February, many families lived on scraps. Meanwhile, nobles dined on venison, swan, beef, and imported spices. Winter feasts were displays of wealth and power. A noble could sit by the fire nibbling candied almonds, while a peasant miles away chewed on stale bread. The difference wasn't just about comfort, it was survival itself. Work and rest for peasants. Winter didn't mean rest. They hauled water, chopped wood, and cared for animals daily. Idleness wasn't an option. One lazy day could mean freezing later. For nobles, winter was a slower season. Farming stopped, and campaigns paused. Lords held courts, managed estates, and sometimes hunted. Ladies oversaw household work, embroidery, and social events. Servants, of course, did the hardest labor behind the scenes. So while peasants sweated and shivered, nobles spent long evenings with music, storytelling, and feasts. Health and illness struck everyone in winter. Smoke-filled cottages spread coughs, while crowded castles bred fevers. But the poor had fewer remedies, and hunger made them weaker. A peasant child might die from a simple fever, while a noble had access to physicians, herbs, and better food. That gap in healthcare was as wide as the gap in diet. Entertainment, in contrast, how people passed the time, also showed the divide. Peasants entertained themselves with gossip, folk tales, and simple games by the fire. They sang songs and carved toys from wood scraps. Nobles, on the other hand, enjoyed elaborate banquets, dances, tournaments, and minstrels. Court life buzzed with pageantry and performance, a world away from the quiet boredom of peasant cottages. Clothing and warmth. The poor wore wool, patched and repatched, until it barely held together. Boots were stuffed with straw, and cloaks were thin. Cold was constant. Nobles wrapped themselves in fine wool, velvet, and furs. Cloaks lined with ermine or fox made winters far more bearable. Yet even lords complained about the chill in stone corridors. In that sense, cold was one thing that united everyone. Dependence and division. Despite the huge gap, the rich still depended on the poor. Nobles relied on peasants to produce food, chop wood, and haul water. Without peasant labor, castles would freeze and starve too. But that dependence didn't erase the divide. Winter highlighted inequality more than any other season. The poor prayed for survival, while the rich turned survival into spectacle. Misery shared, and equally winter was miserable for everyone, but not equally so. Peasants fought hunger, smoke, and freezing nights. Nobles fought boredom, drafts, and the occasional discomfort of too much feasting. One group dreamed of enough bread to fill their stomachs. The other debated whether to eat swan or venison for supper. 2 winters, one world in the end. Medieval winter was to different experiences, happening side by side. The poor endured hardship with resilience, scraping by on little. The rich softened the season with wealth, luxury, and servants. But beneath the furs and feasts, even nobles couldn't escape the truth. Winter was harsh, and no one, oh high or low, could control the snow, the cold, or the endless dark. The mental toll winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just a test of the body. It was a test of the mind. The endless grey skies, freezing nights, and lack of sunlight wore people down in ways that are easy to underestimate. Today, we'd call it seasonal depression. Back then, people just thought of it as life. Still, the mental toll of surviving winter was heavy, and it shaped how communities coped with the cold months. Darkness everywhere. The first problem was darkness. With no electricity, winter nights stretched endlessly. The sun dipped early, leaving hours of blackness. A fire or a few candles helped, but most cottages couldn't afford to burn light all night. That meant evenings were quiet, shadowy, and long. For many, it felt like the world had shrunk to a tiny circle of firelight surrounded by unknown darkness. It was easy to feel small and isolated. Boredom as a burden. Boredom might not sound terrifying, but in a world used to constant labor, it was strange and unsettling. With fields frozen and travel limited, people suddenly had too much free time. Families filled the hours with storytelling, gossip, and simple crafts. But once those routines wore thin, the boredom set in. Too much idle time led to restlessness, anxiety, and sometimes conflict inside cramped homes. Fear of the unknown. Winters were unpredictable. Would food last until spring? Would illness sweep through the village? Would wolves attack? That uncertainty weighed on people constantly. The mental stress of not knowing if you'd make it through winter was enormous. Hope and fear lived side by side, with every empty granary or sick child reminding families how fragile survival was. Cold as a constant companion. Cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Waking up every morning to freezing air, numb fingers, and icy breath wore people down. There's only so long you can laugh or shivering before it eats at your mood. The poor especially felt the despair of unrelenting cold. With thin clothes and little fuel, some winters felt endless. The cold seemed like an enemy that never left you alone. Dreams of spring. One way people coped was by clinging to hope. They marked the days with church feasts, festivals, and calendars, counting down until spring. Stories and songs often spoke of renewal, green fields, and sunlight. Dreaming of warmer days was more than optimism. It was survival for the mind. It reminded people that winter wasn't forever, even when it felt like it. Faith as comfort. Religion was another anchor. The church offered rituals, prayers, and festivals that gave meaning to suffering. Priests preached that hardship tested the soul and promised eternal reward for endurance. For many, believing that God saw their struggles made the misery bearable. Faith turned winter from meaningless suffering into part of a larger story. Togetherness against loneliness. Isolation was one of winter's cruelest tricks. With travel nearly impossible, villages felt cut off from the world. But inside communities, togetherness softened the blow. Families huddled together, neighbors visited, and taverns buzzed with life. Even gossip and petty arguments kept loneliness at bay. Better to argue with your neighbor about whose chicken laid fewer eggs than sit in silence all winter long. Nobles and winter blues. Even the rich weren't immune to the mental toll. Castles were cold, drafty, and often gloomy. Nobles filled time with feasts, hunts, and games, but monotony still crept in. For lords and ladies used to travel and adventure, being stuck indoors for months was frustrating. Wealth softened hunger and cold, but it couldn't always cure boredom or gloom. Folklore and fears. Winter also stirred up the imagination. Long nights gave rise to ghost stories, superstitions, and fears of spirits lurking in the dark. Strange sounds outside could be wolves, thieves, or worse. Folklore was both a comfort and a burden. It gave explanations for the unknown, but it also made the dark feel more frightening. Children huddled closer by the fire, listening wide-eyed to tales that mixed entertainment with warning. Mental resilience despite everything. Medieval people were resilient. They had little choice. They leaned on traditions, faith, and community to keep spirits afloat. They accepted boredom, darkness, and fear as part of life. The mental toll was real, but people endured it with humor, songs, and stubbornness. In a way, resilience itself was their greatest survival skill. Lessons from their struggles today. We grumble about short winter days and gloomy weather, but compared to medieval winters, ours are luxurious. Central heating, electric lights, hot chocolate, all things they couldn't even imagine. Yet their struggles remind us of something important. Surviving winter isn't just about warmth and food. It's about keeping your spirit alive through the dark. And in that, medieval people weren't so different from us. Winter of the mind so. The mental toll of medieval winter was heavy. Darkness bred fear, boredom bred restlessness, cold bred despair. But faith, festivals, and friendship gave hope. Even in the harsher season, people found ways to laugh, to dream, and to carry on. Winter tested their minds as much as their bodies, and somehow they passed. The first signs of spring, down months of freezing nights, smoky cottages, and endless hunger. Spring wasn't just a change of season in the Middle Ages. It was a rescue. The first signs of spring brought hope, joy, and often sheer relief that winter hadn't won this time. Let's step into that moment when snow began to melt and life slowly returned to the land. The first hint of spring came with the thaw. Snowbanks shrank, ice cracked on rivers, and muddy paths reappeared. To us, mud might be annoying. To medieval people, mud was a wonderful sight. It meant the earth was waking up. Children splashed in puddles, animals stretched their legs, and farmers felt their spirits lift. The long dark months had an end after all. The return of green after staring at grey skies and bare fields all winter. That first patch of green was almost magical. Grass pushed through the soil, buds appeared on trees, and herbs poked out of gardens. It wasn't much at first, but it was a promise food would grow again. People watched eagerly for the earliest edible plants, like nettles and leeks, which were welcome after months of salted meat and stale bread. The hunger gap, but spring wasn't instantly easy. In fact, the early months were sometimes the hardest. Supplies from last year's harvest were almost gone, and new crops weren't ready yet. This period was called the hunger gap. Families scraped together their last crumbs, stretching whatever grain or beans they had left. For the poor, the hunger gap could be worse than winter itself. Survival still wasn't guaranteed until the first real harvests came in. Work returned. Spring also meant work. Winter had slowed the farming cycle, but now peasants rushed back to the fields. They ploughed, sowed, and repaired tools. Days grew longer, and labour filled every hour. But compared to sitting in a smoky cottage all winter, even hard work was welcome. The land was alive again, and so were the people working it. Animals rejoiced too. It wasn't just humans who felt relief. Animals that had been cooped up in barns finally got to graze again. Cows gave more milk, sheep grew fatter, and chickens laid more eggs. Fresh milk and eggs were precious after months of scarcity. The sound of animals in open fields was part of spring's music, a reminder that life was back in motion. Festivals of renewal. Communities celebrated spring with festivals, many tied to the church calendar. Easter, in particular, carried themes of rebirth and hope. May Day soon followed, with dancing, games, and greenery. These festivals weren't just fun. They were emotional release after the heaviness of winter. Singing, dancing, and feasting reminded everyone that survival was worth celebrating. Nobles and spring. For nobles, spring meant travel reopened, roads cleared, hunts resumed, and court life grew lively again. Castles brightened with flowers and fresh food. Hunting deer or hawking birds was not just leisure. It symbolized abundance after winter's scarcity. Noble women oversaw gardens, embroidery projects, and spring feasts. The mood in castles shifted from entrance to celebration, just like in the villages below. The smell of hope spring wasn't just seen, it was smelled and felt. The air lost its biting chill and carried scents of soil, grass, and blossoms. Smoke from endless winter fires faded. For people who had endured months of stale air and damp cottages, breathing fresh spring air was almost like medicine. It lifted moods faster than any feast. Children and playchildren, freed from the confinement of winter, ran wild in fields again. They played games, chased animals, and enjoyed the longer daylight. Their laughter carried across villages, signaling the season's joy. For parents, it was also a relief. After months of crowded indoor life, the kids could finally burn off energy outdoors. The mental shift spring wasn't just a physical change, it was a mental one. Hope returned. Optimism replaced dread. Families looked forward to harvests, festivals, and warmer nights. Even though hardship wasn't gone, the promise of life returning gave strength. The psychological weight of winter melted with the snow. Survival remembered surviving winter wasn't taken for granted. Families gave thanks in prayer, sometimes offering gifts to the church or sharing food with neighbors. Each spring felt like a victory. Even small things, like tasting fresh herbs or hearing birdsong, carried deep meaning. After enduring so much, every sign of life felt precious. The eternal cycle spring reminded people of the cycle they lived in. Hardship followed by relief, death followed by rebirth. It gave meaning to the struggles of winter. Without the cold, the return of warmth wouldn't feel so miraculous. The first signs of spring weren't just nature changing, they were proof that survival, once again, had been possible. From misery to renewal so. While medieval winter was pure misery, spring was the opposite, a flood of relief, joy, and hope. The thaw, the green shoots, the festivals, the laughter of children, all were reminders that life continued. Winter tested the body and mind. Spring rewarded the survivors. And year after year, this cycle of misery and renewal shaped medieval lives.